Mr. Speaker.
Andrew Bailey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And it's a pleasure to be talking on this third reading of the Bright Line Test for Residential Land Bill. And particularly after that last speaker, I was getting so worried, I was getting so confused with what he was saying, and then he says at the end that he supports it. So I'm just glad that he's got it clear in his own mind. Mr. Speaker, this is a government trying to deal with an issue of market failure. And of course, the opposition always want to claim that market failure is due to the government. Well, it's not. What we've had is an issue through through the GFC where houses weren't being built, and consequently there has been a shortfall in the number of houses simply because developers weren't prepared to take the risk. But what I do know is that this government is now actively trying to deal with this market failure. And the case in point is the 104 special housing areas that are now in place in Auckland. And I can tell you within my own electorate of Henua, and you should stay and listen to this bit,
Order.
that in my own electorate,
Order.
thank you, in my sorry, excuse me, Mr. Speaker, in my own electorate of Henua, that from my own assessment of all the developments I know are coming to the market over the next 6 years, there will be 13,000 new homes built in my electorate in the next 6 years. That is a substantial amount of houses, representing roughly about 30,000 people moving into my electorate. Now, what this bill does is amends the Income Tax Act 2007 by inserting a new clause which requires property owners and investors to pay income tax on any property that they sell within a 2-year period. Now, most people seem to get very confused about this. This is an income tax which is exactly the same that you would pay if you were buying and selling shares on the stock market. If you are deemed to be a trader, you pay income tax just as this Act is seeking to apply to those trading in houses. Now, the 2-year rule is slightly different. In the normal course of event, it applies from the date of registration of the acquisition of date of the land through to the date that that property is sold. There's a slight amendment for apartments, which applies when the initial date of the 2-year applies when entering into an agreement to buy the property, and that's an important little distinction that's been applied. Also, it's very clear that this only applies to residential land, and there's an issue that if in the case you have a store that, corner store that has a residential property at the back, only if it's deemed to be more than 50%, the building is deemed to occupy more than 50% for the purposes of building for business, then it would be excluded from this Act. So what this bill also does is make 3 very clear exemptions. The first one is if you are buying and selling a property within 2 years and is your normal house of residence, and that of course applies to virtually most transactions in the country, that exclusion is one that all New Zealanders can rely on, i.e. if they buy and sell their house and they live in it, they will be excluded from this full stop. The second exclusion is if you're selling a property within 2 years, if you're having a matrimonial dispute, and thirdly, if you inherit some property. So I think the most important thing about this bill, and this is the bit that opposition certainly haven't talked about today, this bill should be seen in the context of a number of new initiatives that this government and the Reserve Bank have brought into force. So just dealing with the latter, we're all aware that the OCR rate and the deposit rate, the LVR, that the Reserve Bank have applied to the Auckland market has moved to a rate of 30%. So this is a heavy requirement on banks to make sure that they're not lending extraordinary amounts of money to people, and that making sure that the deposit rate that people have to have before they can enter into funding agreements with banks is at a suitable level. And that already is showing some benefit, and the Reserve Bank Governor and the Finance and Expenditure Committee was remarking on it yesterday, that we're now seeing a flattening off of property prices in Auckland. But the second thing is in terms of the legislation that this government has already passed, is we passed the Taxation, Land Information and Offshore Persons Information Bill. And this is the bill that dealt with the question of requiring investors to make sure they get a bank account and an IRD number. So, Mr. Speaker, on that note, I think this is a very comprehensive bill. We're going to see another piece of legislation next year dealing with resident withholding tax, and in that context, I commend it to the House and I'm happy to support it.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. The contrary, no. The ayes have it. A party vote has been called for. The clerk will conduct a party vote.
New Zealand National.
59 votes in favour.
New